The bell above the bakery door rang twice before she realized her hands had not stopped moving. Flour, water, a pinch of salt the color of old snow, and the small brass weight she kept on the counter for the loaves she sold to the doctor's wife on Thursdays. Outside, the village square was waking the way villages on the southern coast always woke, with a yawn of fishermen and the clatter of a cart whose wheel had needed mending for as long as she had lived here. Inside, two small boys sat on the bottom step of the stairs that led up to the rooms above the shop, kicking their heels in unison, watching her with the patient, conspiratorial attention of children who knew the rhythm of their mother's mourning by heart. She did not look up at the door. She knew the sound of the regulars, and she knew the sound of strangers, and the sound that had just come through the door was neither. It was the sound of a man who had paused on the threshold because he had not expected to find what he had found. She set down the brass weight. She wiped her hands on the apron tied twice around her waist. She told the boys, without turning, to go upstairs and finish the bread and milk Marin had set out for them. They went because they were good boys and because they had learned without being told that when their mother's voice flattened into that particular calm, the world was about to ask something of her. She heard the small thunder of their feet on the wooden steps. She heard the door at the top of the stairs click shut behind them. Only then did she turn around. He was standing exactly where the morning light fell across the threshold, a long figure cut clean against the brightness, and even after 7 years, she did not need the second glance she gave him. She had known the moment the bell rang twice. The bell only ever rang twice for a man who held a door open longer than he needed to, the way a man does when he is not certain whether he is arriving or being received. He had taken off his hat. He held it in both hands, the way one holds a cup that might still be too hot. His traveling coat was dusted along the hem with the pale grit of the coast road. He looked older. Not greatly older, carefully older, the way certain men aged, as if time had been asked very politely to leave the eyes alone. She had a few seconds to decide. She knew this. She had practiced, in the way a person practices the answer to a question they hope will never be asked, what she would say if he ever stood in that doorway. She had rehearsed the words at the well, in the long blue hour before the ovens needed lighting, walking back from the cliff path with a basket on her hip. She had smoothed them, weighed each one against the silence she expected to follow. The silence did not come. He spoke first. "Hello, Beatrix," he said, and he said it the way one might say the name of a house one had once lived in and no longer had the key to. She did not say his name. She crossed the small flagged floor to the door and turned the wooden sign from open to closed with a click that sounded, to her own ears, far louder than it ought to have done. She did not lock it. She had never been one for locking doors against weather she had already let in. Then she walked back to the counter, set both hands flat on the floured wood, and looked at him as if he were a customer whose order she had not yet quite caught. "You found me," she said. He nodded once. It was not the nod of a man being praised. It was the nod of a man acknowledging a sentence he had been carrying like a stone for years and was finally permitted to set down. "I did," he said. "You took your time." The corner of his mouth almost did something. It almost smiled. It declined. "I did," he said again, more quietly. She let the silence hold. He did not fill it. He was the only man she had ever known who could decline to fill a silence and not appear rude. It had been one of the first things she had noticed about him, in another country, in another life, in a long room with too many candles and too many people pretending to listen to a quartet. She had thought, then, that a man who would not chatter was a man who could be trusted with the things one did not say. She had been right about the first half of that sentence and ruinously wrong about the second. "There is bread in the oven," she said. "I cannot speak with you until it is out. You may sit." He sat. He chose the small bench by the window, not the chair at the little table, which she noted and did not comment upon. The bench faced the counter and the door and not the stairs. He was a man who understood, even now, where the exits in a room lived. She turned to the oven. She would not let her hands shake. She would not give him that. She slid the wooden peel under the first loaf and drew it out into the pale dawn of her kitchen, and she set it on the rack to cool. And the smell of it was the smell of every morning she had built in this village by herself, with a child on her hip and another at her ankle and a cough she could not afford to be ill from, and she breathed it in deliberately, like a person taking a draught of courage from a known well. Behind her, on the bench, the Earl of Ashradon, though he had never used the title in her hearing, and would not now, watched the back of her neck where a single damp strand of hair clung to the skin, and he did not allow himself to look at the stairs. The bell rang once. A real customer. This time, the widow Petrelli, who came every morning for a small loaf and a piece of conversation she paid for in coin and gossip. Beatrix served her with the practiced cheer of 7 years' habit, asked after her cat by name, asked after her son in the Navy by name, took the coin, smiled, and felt the man on the bench making himself, by sheer act of will, into a piece of furniture so as not to be marked. The widow Petrelli looked at him exactly once, in the way village widows look at strange men in shops they consider partly their own, decided he was no one she had a duty toward, and went away. The bell rang. The door closed. They were alone again, and the bread was cool enough to wrap, and there was nothing now between Beatrix and the question she had been refusing for 7 years, except the width of a small flowered counter and a brass weight that had once belonged to her mother. She set the brass weight to one side. She came around the counter. She did not sit. "Say what you came to say," she said, "and be quick, because in 2 hours my sons will be home from the cove with the netmender's children, and I will not have them find you here without warning." He looked at her. He looked at her the way she had once seen him look at a horse he had been told had been ruined and which he intended to prove had not been. "Beatrix," he said. "There are 2 of them." "Yes," she said. "There are." "How old?" he asked, and his voice was so level it was almost not a voice. She held his eyes. She did not look away. She did not soften. She did not lie. "Old enough," she said, "that you might have done the arithmetic on the doorstep." He closed his eyes. Only for a moment. When he opened them again, the morning light had moved a finger's width across the floor, and something in him had moved, too, although he would not have permitted anyone, least of all her, to see precisely what. She turned back to the bread because she had to do something with her hands, or she would forget how the hands worked. She wrapped the small loaf in clean linen and tied it with twine. She did not look at him while she did it. She said, "You will want tea." He said, "I want nothing." She said, "You will have tea, because if you do not have tea, you will sit on that bench like a man who has come to claim something, and that is not what is going to happen in this room today." He inclined his head. She filled the kettle from the jug. She set it on the stove. She kept her back to him for longer than the task required. There was a small mirror nailed above the spice shelf, the one Marin had brought from her mother's house when she had come to live with them 3 winters ago, and in the mirror Beatrix could see him without turning, see the way he sat with both hands resting on the brim of the hat in his lap, see the way he was studying the room. He was reading her life. He was a careful reader. He always had been. She watched him take in the small jar of wildflowers on the windowsill, the wooden spoon worn shiny on one side from being held in a left hand, The row of 3 earthenware mugs hung from pegs above the counter. Only 3. Never 4, because they had been a household of 3 for as long as the boys could remember, and the 4th peg was empty as a matter of principle. She watched him take in the row of penciled marks on the doorframe, where Marin had been measuring the boys against the wood every spring. She watched his eyes pause there longer than anywhere else, and she watched him look away from them with the precision of a man choosing not to step on something fragile. She had not expected that. She had expected many things from him. In this hour she had pictured 1,000 times, but tenderness of that particular kind was not on the list she had prepared. The kettle began to sing. She lifted it from the stove. She poured. She set a chipped blue cup on the bench beside him, without ceremony, the way she would have done for any tired traveler, the way she had done 100 times for fishermen who had walked all night against a contrary wind. He took the cup with both hands. He did not drink. He held it as if the warmth of it were a piece of information he needed to receive. "How did you find me?" she said. She did not phrase it as a question. He looked up. "There was a girl in a tavern in Genoa," he said, "who could imitate a song you used to sing. She had learned it from a woman who said she had learned it from a baker on the coast." It took 2 more years. There were other things to follow, letters that did not arrive, people who had been kind to you and would not say where you had gone. "I did not push them. I did not want to be the man who pushed them. I am sorry it took as long as it did. I am not sorry I came." She set the lid on the teapot a touch harder than she had meant to. The lid rang against the rim like a small bell, and the small bell, by the laws of this room, meant the end of one subject and the beginning of another. "You did not come for the song," she said. He did not pretend to misunderstand. "No," he said. "Then why?" she said. He did not answer at once. He looked at the cup in his hands. He looked at the row of 3 mugs. He looked, very carefully, at a point on the floor that was neither her face nor the stairs. "Because Olivia died in February," he said. The room did not change. The bread continued to cool. The sea, outside, continued the steady muttered conversation it had with the cliff. And yet something in Beatrix that had been held for 7 years like a fist around a small sharp thing loosened by a single precise degree. Not opened. "Loosened," she said. "I am sorry." She said it because she had been raised to say it, and because it was true in the bewildering way such things were true when the person who had broken your life was no longer in the world to be either forgiven or refused. She did not say more. She did not ask how. She did not ask whether there had been pain, or peace, or which. He seemed to understand that she was not going to ask. He said, "She left a letter for you. She is the reason I knew to begin looking again. She wrote to you for years. She never sent any of them. I found them after. She wished, at the end, very much that you should have them. I have brought them. They are at the inn. I will not give them to you today. I do not want them to be the first thing about today." Beatrix turned away from him. She walked to the small window above the counter and put her hand flat against the cool of the glass. The square outside was busy now, the fishwomen carrying their flat baskets, the priest crossing the cobbles with his collar damp at the throat from the climb up from the harbor. She had built this view. She had paid for it in coin she had earned with her own arms. She had paid for it in years of not turning around in the street when she thought she heard a particular kind of laugh. She had paid for it in not telling her sons that the man in the small framed silhouette in the drawer upstairs was anyone in particular, only a friend of their grandfather's, only someone she had once known when she had lived on the other side of a sea. She did not turn around. She said, "You found me because she pointed you." He said, "She pointed me. But I would have come anyway." She did not say, I know. She thought it. She thought. You would have come, because you were always coming. Even when you did not know that you were. Even on the day I left, you were already coming. You simply had not been told yet. He set the cup down on the bench beside him. Untouched, he said. Beatrix, she said, do not. He said, may I say one thing? She said, you may say one thing, and then you will leave my shop, and you will come back tomorrow, at the hour I tell you, and you will not come back today. Because I have to tell my children, and I will not have them told by a stranger in a coat. He said, that is fair. She said, one thing. He said, I did not. She waited. He did not embroider. He did not protest. He did not justify. He said only those 3 words, and then the small, careful silence that followed them, which was, in its own way, the rest of the sentence. I did not. I did not do what you saw. I did not do what you thought you saw. I did not have what you went to the harbor believing I had. He did not say any of those longer sentences. He said only, I did not. And then he stopped. She had imagined many times that he would defend himself loudly. She had imagined that he would bring evidence. She had imagined him kneeling, and she had imagined him angry, and she had imagined him cold. And she had not imagined this, that he would come into her shop after 7 years and offer her only 2 words and a silence, and trust her to know the shape of what they meant. She did not answer. She did not move from the window. After a while, he stood. He did not approach her. He set the chipped blue cup back on the bench so quietly that the small saucer beneath did not chime. He picked up his hat. He said, I am at the inn under the name Ashbourne. I will be there however long you wish me to be there. I will not come up the hill again until you send for me. He said, thank you for the tea. He opened the door himself. The bell rang twice. He went out. She did not turn around until the bell had stopped, and even then she did not turn until she had counted, very precisely, to 20, because she did not trust her face yet, and the face was the one thing in this kitchen she still owned outright. She did not send for him for 3 days. On the first day, she did the things one does when one's life has been struck like a bell, and one must keep walking through the ringing of it. She baked. She sold. She balanced the small leather book in which she kept her accounts. She wiped down the counters twice in the evening instead of once. She ate a piece of bread standing up at the back step, looking down toward the harbor, and she watched, without appearing to watch, the lit windows of the inn at the far end of the breakwater. The third window from the left, on the upper floor, stayed lit longer than the others. She did not allow herself to wonder whether he was reading, or writing, or simply sitting on the edge of a strange bed, with his hands on his knees and his eyes on the dark. She told the boys, on the first evening after the supper plates were cleared, that a man had come to the village who had once known her in the country where she had been born. She said his name. She said it carefully, the way one introduces an unfamiliar fruit to a small mouth, a single bite at a time. Matteo, who was the elder by 11 minutes and the more deliberate, set his spoon down and asked whether the man was kind. Tomas, who was the younger and the one who asked his questions sideways, asked whether the man was the one in the silhouette. Beatrix had not known they had ever looked in that drawer. She did not show that she had not known. She said, that drawer is not a forbidden drawer, but it is not a drawer we open without asking. Tomas said, we did ask. We asked Marin. Marin had been at the sink. Marin had not turned around. Marin, who had once been a lady's maid in a great house in another country, and who had walked away from it for reasons she had explained to Beatrix in 3 sentences 7 years ago, and never again, did not turn around now either, only said, mildly into the dishwater, you did not ask me. You told me you had already looked." Tomas accepted this correction with the grave equanimity of a small boy who had been outmaneuvered by a fair opponent. He returned to his spoon. He said, "Again, is he the one in the silhouette?" Beatrix said, "Yes." She said it without flinching, because she had decided, in the long, sleepless hour before dawn, that she would not flinch in front of them. She said, "He is a person from very long ago, and he is here for a little while, and you will not see him until I have decided when you will see him, and you will not ask questions in the square about him, because the square is not where we have our conversations." The boys agreed, gravely, the way the boys agreed to all things that were said in that particular tone. They went up to bed. Marin stayed at the sink. She finished the last of the cups. She dried her hands. She said, without looking at Beatrix, "Do you wish me to take them to my sister's for a few days?" Beatrix said, "No. I wish you to keep them as you always keep them, and I wish you to know that I will tell you everything you need to know, in the order that you need to know it, and I wish you to know that I am grateful." Marin nodded once. She said, "I told you he would come." She said it without triumph and without reproach, only as one might note that a long-anticipated tide had at last arrived at the harbor. Then she went up the stairs with the lamp, and Beatrix stayed in the dark kitchen until the kettle had grown cold and the loaves on the rack had passed the hour at which they would have been at their best for selling. She wrapped them anyway. She would sell them at half price in the morning to the fishermen, who knew the difference and did not mind, who said the day-old bread held a knife better. On the second day she went up the cliff path alone. She told Marin she was going to look at the small field above the chapel that the old Gothard had said he meant to sell, and she did go, briefly. And she did look at it, because she had been considering it for 2 years and would have been ashamed to lie even by omission about it. Then she walked past it, and along the cliff, and she sat on the bench the village had built where the path turned. The bench from which one could see the whole curve of the bay and the small white house, with the green shutters on the headland and the inn at the far end of the breakwater, and she sat there for an hour without crying, and then for 10 minutes during which she cried, briefly and silently, in the manner of a person who has been waiting 7 years for permission to do so and finds the permission, when it comes, less of a flood than she had feared. She wiped her face with the sleeve of her dress. She watched a gull negotiate with the wind. She thought, with the dry, small voice that had kept her alive, that the gull had a great deal to say to the wind, and the wind was declining to comment. She almost smiled. She did not. She walked home. On the 3rd morning, she wrote a note. She wrote it on a half sheet of paper torn from the back of the accounts book, because she did not own writing paper and would not buy any for this purpose. She wrote, "Come tomorrow at 4, by the back door, not the front and not before." She did not sign it. She gave it to the netmender's eldest, who was 12 and discreet, and who owed her a number of small loaves, and she paid him a coin anyway, because she had learned early that one did not trade in favors for the things that mattered. He went down to the inn with the note folded twice in his hand and came back 40 minutes later with an answer folded the same way. The answer said, "I will be there." It said nothing else. She did not show it to Marin. She put it in the drawer with the silhouette. The 4th day was a market day, and she sold out by noon, which was unusual and not, she told herself, an omen. She sent the boys, after lunch with Marin, to the netmender's wife, who had promised them she would teach them how to splice a rope, a skill the boys had been requesting with the relentless patience of small craftsmen for half a year. They went. She stood in her shop alone. She washed the counter. She put the brass weight back where it lived. She took off her flower gray apron and put on the clean one. She did not change her dress, because she would not let him imagine, even for a moment, that she had dressed for him. She set out 2 cups on the small table by the back door which opened onto the kitchen garden where she grew rosemary and 3 kinds of bean and the small fig tree she had carried as a cutting from a friend's garden 2 villages over. She put a plate of yesterday's loaf, sliced. She put a small dish of the salted oil she made herself. She did not put out wine. At 4 exactly, he knocked. She let him in. He had not brought his hat this time. He had brought, instead, a small leather case, which he set down by the door without comment, and a parcel wrapped in oilcloth, which he held in both hands until she gestured at the table, at which point he set it down between them as a man might set down a sleeping child. She did not ask what was in the parcel. She knew. She said, "Sit." He sat. She poured. She said, "You will tell me what happened that night, and you will tell me only what is true, and you will tell me without ornament, because I cannot afford ornament." He nodded. He said, "I will." He looked at the parcel, and then at her, and then at his own hands, and he began. He said, "You came back early from your aunt's because the carriage was light. I did not know you were coming back early. I had ridden over to your aunt's that afternoon to fetch the letter she had promised me, the one with the affidavit from the doctor in Bristol, and I had not found her at home, and I had returned to the house in something of a temper, because the letter was the entire point of the week, and without it I could do nothing on the Monday. Olivia was at the house. She had ridden over from her brother's the day before, because she had quarreled with him, and your aunt had given her the small east room. I had not known she was at the house either. I had supposed her still at her brother's. I went to the library because it was the room in which one went when one wished not to be spoken to. And she was there, and she was crying. He paused. He did not look away from Beatrix. He said, she was crying because she had at last allowed herself to understand that the man she had been promised to was the man she had been promised to, and not the man she had been pretending he was. I am telling you this in this way because she is no longer here to tell it in her own. I did not love her. I have never loved her. I had known her since we were children, the way one knows the people one has been put on horses next to since one was 4. I sat down with her. I did not sit close. I sat in the chair by the window. She came over and sat on the floor by my chair, and she put her forehead against my knee, and she cried, and I put my hand on her hair because I had grown up putting my hand on her hair when she cried, and she was, at that moment, more nearly a sister to me than anything else. That was what you saw. That was the entire of what you saw. I did not look up. I did not hear the door. I did not hear you on the landing. I did not hear you go down the back stairs. I did not know you had been in the house at all until your maid came to me an hour later in the stable yard, white as flour, with your glove in her hand, and told me you had ridden out toward the coast with one valise and her sister's name on a slip of paper. He stopped. He said, I do not say this to defend the picture. I say this because the picture was a picture, and you, who have always seen pictures very precisely, saw it precisely, and were not wrong about what you saw. You were wrong only about what it meant. He went on. He said, by the time I reached the harbor the ship had sailed. I followed to the next port. You had already taken a smaller boat south. I followed to the south. You had gone east. You had taken pains. You were extremely good at taking pains. I respected the pains. I went home. I waited for a letter. None came. I wrote to your aunt. She wrote back that she had heard from you only once, and that you had asked her, in the letter, to tell no one anything, and that she intended to honor you. She did honor you. She did not tell me where you were. She told me only that you were alive, and that you were not in want, and that I was to leave the question alone. I left it alone for 2 years because I had been asked. He said, I did not leave it alone after that. He said, I broke the engagement to Olivia 3 weeks after you left. I did it quietly because I did not want it to be a story. She did not contest it. We were friends until the end. I want you to know that. I want you to know that she was not punished by my hand for what she had not done, and I want you to know that she understood before the end what she had cost you without intending to, and what she had cost me, and that she carried it well. I would have you, if you can, think of her without hatred. Because she would have wished it, he said, I did not marry. He said this without weight. He said it the way one might mention that one had not, in a particular year, traveled north. He said, I did not marry because I had married, in my own mind, on the morning you and I sat under the lime tree at your father's house, and you told me that you had decided you would have me, and that you had decided this on a Tuesday, and that you had reached the decision in the time it took the cook to bring out the second pot of tea. I had thought then that I had been the slower of us. I had thought I had been catching up. I had not understood until you were gone that you had been generous to me in saying it that way, and that I had been catching up to a person who had already arrived at the place I was meant to live. He stopped. He looked at the parcel. He did not touch it. He said, Olivia died in February. I will tell you, when you are ready, how. I will tell you that it was not sudden and that she had time. She used the time to write letters. Most of them were to her brother. Some were to me. 2 were not sent. One of them was to you. The other was to the woman whose name appears on a card in the small drawer of her writing desk and whom her brother is taking pains to find. He said, the letter to you is in this parcel. I have not read it. I have read no letter in this parcel that was meant for you. The parcel also contains the letters she wrote to you and did not send, the ones she had written across the years, beginning the week after you sailed. There are, I am told, 11 of them. I have not counted them myself. I did not feel I had the right. He said, I have come to give them to you. I have come because she asked me to come. I have come because I would have come anyway, even if she had not asked, the moment I knew where you were. I will not pretend that the first reason and the second reason are not braided. I will only say that I am here, and that I am here under the name Ashbourne, and that I have not used the title since the year you left, except where the law has required it of me. I am here as a private man. I am not here to claim. He said, the boys. She said, do not. He stopped. He looked at his hands. He said, I will not ask. I will not name them in this room until you have named them to me. I will wait for whatever you choose to give me. I will not press a single inch beyond what you offer. I came to put the letters in your hand. I came to tell you that I did not. I came because I could not, in the time I have left as a living man, allow you to go on believing of me what you have been allowed to believe. Beatrix sat for a long time. The garden made the small evening sounds gardens make. A bee considered the rosemary and went elsewhere. The fig tree, which she had pruned that morning with more attention than the tree required, stood with its leaves perfectly still, as if it too were listening. She thought, with the dry, small voice that had kept her alive, that the fig tree was being obliging. She almost smiled. She did not. She said, at last, you are telling me the truth. He said, I am. She said, I knew you were. She said, I knew it the moment you stood in my doorway and said only I did not. I knew it because you would not have come if it were not so. I have known the shape of your courage and the shape of your dishonesty, and they are not the same shape, and the shape that stood in my doorway was the first and not the second." She said, "I have been very angry with you for 7 years, and I have been more angry with myself, because I went down the back stairs without turning around, and I went to the harbor without writing, and I went on a boat without a name. And I did all of those things because I had decided, on the landing, in the half-second between the door and the stairs, that I would not be the woman who stayed to be told. I would be the woman who left before she was told. I had been raised by a woman who stayed to be told, and I had watched what it had done to her, and I had decided I would not be that. I am telling you this because you should know that what you came to repair I had, in part, broken myself." He bowed his head, not in submission, in acknowledgement. He said, "We agreed on a great many things, you and I. We agreed that we would not pretend. We agreed that we would not be cruel. We agreed that we would not, if we could help it, allow a misunderstanding to become a life. We failed at the third. I am not asking you to repair it. I am asking you to let me sit at this table while you decide whether you will allow me to know your children, in whatever measure, on whatever terms. I will accept anything you set. I will accept nothing if that is what you set." Beatrix poured him more tea, although his cup was still full, and she did this because her hands had to do something, and because pouring tea for a man who had said what he had just said was, in the small private grammar of her kitchen, a form of answer. She did not say yes that day, and she did not say no. She said, "Come tomorrow at the same hour, by the same door, and bring nothing, and I will tell you when you may meet them." He said, "I will." He stood. He did not reach for the parcel. He said, "This stays with you." She said, "I know." He said, "I will not ask whether you have read them until you tell me you have." She said, "I know." He said, "Thank you." He went out the back way. She locked the door behind him for the first time in 3 years. She sat at the table for a long while with the parcel between her hands. She did not open it that night. She put it on the high shelf in her own room, behind the small stack of folded sheets that no one ever moved, and she went down to the kitchen, and she made the boys their supper, and she listened to Thomas tell a long and confidently inaccurate story about a fish the netmender's wife had shown him, and she laughed at the parts where she was meant to laugh. And she answered Matteo's serious question about whether ropes had feelings with the seriousness it deserved, and she put them to bed, and she sat with Marin at the table for an hour without speaking, and Marin did not ask, and Beatrix did not say, and at the end of the hour Marin rose and kissed the top of Beatrix's head as if Beatrix were the younger of them, which in certain ways she had always been, and went up to bed. Beatrix opened the parcel 3 nights later. She read the 11 letters in order, beginning with the first, which had been written 9 days after she had sailed, and ending with the last, which had been written in the week before Olivia died, and which began with the words, "Dearest B, I have run out of time to be a coward." She read them slowly. She did not skip. She read the one in which Olivia explained the library, and she read the one in which Olivia explained the engagement, and she read the one in which Olivia explained that she had loved a woman in Bath whom her family would not let her name, and that she had been crying that afternoon for that woman, and not for the man on whose knee her forehead had rested. And she read the one in which Olivia apologized, in the plainest sentences Olivia had ever written, for having let a misunderstanding stand because, in the months after Beatrix had gone, the misunderstanding had been the only thing that allowed Olivia to keep her own secret from her brother, and she read the last letter, which apologized for none of it again, because Olivia had already done all the apologizing the letters could hold, and which said only, "Find her, and tell her I did not deserve her friendship, and tell her I had it anyway, and tell her she has in my will the small house in Lyme which my mother left me, because she is the only person I ever knew who could have made anything of it, and tell her I loved her in the way I knew how, which was perhaps not the best way, but was the only way I had. Beatrix folded the letters back into the parcel. She did not cry. She had cried on the cliff. She had used her ration. She sat at the small table in her own room until the candle had burned down by half, and then she went downstairs and stood at the back door and looked at the light still burning in the third window from the left of the inn, and she thought, with the dry, small voice that had kept her alive, that he was reading, or writing, or simply sitting on the edge of a strange bed with his hands on his knees and his eyes on the dark. She thought it without bitterness for the first time in 7 years. The next morning, she sent the netmender's eldest down to the inn with another note. The note said, 4 o'clock. The boys will be in the garden. You may meet them by the fig tree. You will be a friend of their grandfather's, who has come from the country where I was born, and that is all you will be on the first day. The answer came back within the hour. It said, I will be there. He came at 4. He came without the leather case. He came without the parcel. He came in a plainer coat than he had worn the first day, and he had let himself walk up the hill rather than hire the cart, and his boots were dusted again with the pale grit of the coast road, and Beatrix met him at the back gate and looked at him for one long moment before she opened it. She said, You will not touch them on the first day. He said, I will not. She said, You will not say anything that they cannot understand. He said, I will not. She said, If at any point I lift my hand, you will go inside with Marin, and you will not come back into the garden until I send for you. He said, I will. She said, Do not weep in front of them. He said, I will not. He kept that promise, and he did not keep it in the way a person sometimes keeps a promise, by holding it in both hands and letting the edges show. He sat on the low wooden bench Beatrix had built herself the second summer in this house. The boys were at the far end of the garden when he came in, crouched over an arrangement of small stones that had, in the secret grammar of small boys, an entire civilization in it. Matteo looked up first. He looked at the man on the bench with the long, careful look of a child who had been told, the night before, that a friend of his grandfather's was coming, and who had been deciding since dawn what a friend of his grandfather's might be expected to look like. Tomas looked up second, because Tomas always looked up second, and Tomas said, Are you the man? And Beatrix, behind him, said evenly, Tomas, and Tomas, without turning, said, I am being polite, mother. And the man on the bench said, before Beatrix could draw breath, I am the man you mean, and yes, I am also being polite. Matteo, who appreciated this, smiled. Tomas, who had a different system, did not smile yet, but came closer. He stopped at the distance from which a small, careful animal first considers a larger, careful one. He said, What is your name? The man on the bench said, Henry. Tomas considered this. He said, What is your other name? The man on the bench said, Ashbourne. Tomas said, That is the name on the post at the inn. The man on the bench said, Yes. Tomas said, Mother said you were a friend of our grandfather's. The man on the bench said, I was. Tomas said, Which grandfather? Beatrix, very quietly, from the doorway said, The one we do not speak of often, my love, because he is far away. Tomas accepted this, with the grave equanimity of a small boy who had been told, on many other occasions, that there were doors one did not open without asking. He said, Do you like the sea? The man on the bench said, I am learning to. Tomas said, You have not learned yet. The man on the bench said, No. Tomas said, "We will teach you." Matteo, by now, had risen and walked the careful diagonal of a child who has decided to be braver than the other, and Matteo said, "You can sit at the table at supper if Mother says." Beatrix did not say yet. She did not say no. She said, "We will see." The man on the bench said, "That is fair." The boys returned to their stones. They did not look at him again for some time, except in the small, swift glances by which children check the position of a sun. The man on the bench did not look at them either. He looked at the fig tree, which was, Beatrix observed, being obliging, and he looked at the wall over which the rosemary spilled, and he looked, once, very briefly, at Beatrix, and then he looked back at the fig tree. He kept his promise. He did not weep. He kept his other promise, too. He held it in both hands. The edges showed. Beatrix saw them, and did not lift her hand, and did not send him in. He stayed in the village through the summer and into the autumn, and the village made of him what villages make of a quiet man who pays his bill on time and does not give offense. The widow Petrelli decided, after the third week, that he was the son of a distant cousin of her husband's, on the grounds that he had the same chin, which was not true, and which no one corrected. The priest, who had been a tutor in his youth and missed the work, found that the Englishman knew a great deal of mathematics, and they fell into the habit, on Wednesday evenings, of sitting in the back room of the priest's house with a small pot of coffee and a slate, working through whatever problem the priest had set himself that month. The netmender's wife, who had been suspicious of him at first because he spoke too softly, decided, after he had spent an entire afternoon helping her son drag a snagged net off a rock, that softness in a man was not necessarily a sign of softness in his hands, and she revised her view. He took rooms above the Chandlers on the second month because the inn was too dear for a stay of unknown length, and the rooms had a small window that looked across the slate roofs to the slope where the bakery sat, and he did not mention to anyone, including Beatrix, that he could, from that window, see the kitchen door. Beatrix knew. She knew because she had walked once, in the second week, down past the Chandlers to the harbor, and she had looked up, and she had seen the small square of his light, and she had measured, with the bricklayer's eye she had inherited from her father, the angle from his window to her door. And she had thought, with the dry small voice that had kept her alive, that he had taken those rooms because of that angle, and had not asked her permission, and was right not to have asked, because to ask would have been to acknowledge, and the not asking was a kindness. He came to supper. Eventually, he came once a week at first, on Sundays, when the bakery was closed and the boys were at their most patient because they had eaten well at midday. He did not come bearing gifts. He had asked in the second week whether he might, and Beatrix had said, "Not yet," and he had said, then, "Not yet." He came empty-handed and useful. He carried things. He fixed the hinge on the back gate that Beatrix had been meaning to fix for 2 years. He read aloud, when the boys asked, from the small worn book of stories Marin kept on the kitchen shelf, the one with the pirate and the donkey. And he did the voices, badly at first and then with growing accuracy, until Tomos declared, one Sunday, that the donkey's voice was now the correct voice, and Matteo, who was the keeper of correctness in that household, confirmed the ruling. He did not call them son. He did not call them, in front of them, anything but Matteo and Tomas. He said their names carefully, the way one says the names of horses one has been told have been ruined, and which one intends to prove have not been. He did not touch them. He waited. Tomas was the first to touch him, which Beatrix had predicted to Marin in a whisper one evening, as they kneaded together. Tomas, in the 8th week, walking past the bench in the garden, put his small flat hand briefly on the man's shoulder without looking at him. in the way a child sometimes confirms the existence of a piece of furniture they have decided to like and walked on. The man on the bench did not turn his head. He did not break the spell. He went on looking at the fig tree, which went on being obliging, and Beatrix, watching from the kitchen window, set her hand against the cool of the glass and let her shoulders, for one half breath, come down from where they had lived for 7 years. Matteo took longer. Matteo was the elder by 11 minutes and was the keeper of the household's seriousness, and the keeper of the household's seriousness did not bestow his shoulder lightly. Matteo waited until the 10th week, when the man had come on a Wednesday rather than a Sunday, because Beatrix had broken her wrist trying to lift a sack of flour that ought to have been split into 2, and the man had carried, that week, the things she could not lift, without speaking of it, and without making her say thank you, and at the end of the week, Matteo, of his own initiative, brought him a cup of water from the pump, and put it into his hand and said, "You are doing it correctly." The man on the bench said, gravely, "Thank you." Matteo said, "You will do it more correctly with practice." The man on the bench said, gravely, "I am sure I will." Matteo went away. The man on the bench did not look at Beatrix. He drank the water. He did not weep. He held it in both hands. The edges showed. Beatrix, by then, had begun to read the other letters, not Olivia's, those she had finished. The other letters. The ones he had brought in the leather case on the second visit, which she had refused that day, and which he had taken back to the inn, and which she had, in the 7th week, sent the netmender's eldest down to fetch. They were not letters he had written to her. They were the records of 7 years. They were the small leather book in which he had kept, each month, the figures of an account he had opened in her name with a bank in Genoa, into which he had paid a fixed sum on the 1st of each month for 7 years, and which she had never touched because she had not known of it, and which had, by virtue of his patience and the bank's interest, grown into a quantity that made her sit down very abruptly at her own table. They were the deed to the small field above the chapel, which he had bought, quietly, through the priest's brother, in the 3rd year, on the chance that she might one day wish for it. They were the receipt for a passage to England, single in her name, dated and renewed each spring, which had been waiting in a shipping office in the next port for 7 years in case she ever changed her mind. They were a folder of legal documents, drawn up by a London firm she had never heard of, in which he had, in the 2nd year of her absence, settled upon her, in a private trust she could not refuse because she had not been told of it, and which she could not be deprived of by anyone including himself, an income that did not require her to be alive in any particular country or under any particular name. They were a second folder, in which the same firm had drawn up, in the 4th year, an arrangement by which, should 2 children ever be presented to that firm bearing certain marks of identity, and a certain countersignature from a woman the firm knew by a description and not by a name, those children would be received as his lawful issue, with all that the law of his country permitted. The second folder was dated the 4th year. The 4th year was the year, Beatrix realized, in which the song had reached him in Genoa. She set the folder down. She sat at the small table in her own room for a long time. She did not cry. She had cried on the cliff. She had used her ration. She thought, with the dry, small voice that had kept her alive, that a man who would not say in 7 years that he had been doing these things was a man who had understood very precisely that the doing of them was not a claim. She thought also that she had been a fool to believe, on the landing 7 years ago, that she had known the shape of his courage. She had known half of it. She had not known the half that waited. She went to him in the 11th week. She went down the hill to the chandler's in the middle of an afternoon, alone, without a basket and without an errand, which was the thing in the village most likely to be remarked, and she did not care. Because she had decided, the night before, that she would no longer arrange her life around what the square would say. She climbed the narrow stair to his door. She knocked. He opened the door. He was in shirt sleeves. There was ink on his cuff, and a small, careful pile of figures on the table by the window, and the priest's slate leaning against the leg of the table because they had not finished Wednesday's problem, and a single chair by the small stove, and on the small stove a kettle that was not yet singing. He stepped back to let her in. He did not speak. She stepped in. She closed the door behind her. She said, "I have read the letters." He said, "I am glad." She said, "I have read the other things." He said, "Ah." She said, "You should have told me." He said, "I should not have. I should not have, because if I had told you in the first year, you would have refused them, and you would have been right to refuse them, because you had a life to build that was not built out of my conscience. I should not have told you in the second year, because by the second year you had begun to build it, and any word from me would have been a hand on the loom, and I would not put my hand on your loom. I should not have told you at all, until you had asked. And you had not asked, and so I did not tell you. I am sorry that you found out from a folder. I would have preferred to put it in your hand. I would not have preferred to put it in your hand any sooner than this." She looked at him. She had thought she had known him. She had known half. She said, "Sit down." He sat down. She said, "I am not going to England." He said, "I had not assumed you would." She said, "I am not bringing the boys to England." He said, "I had not asked." She said, "You will not, in any document, in any letter, in any conversation in this village or in any other, refer to them as your sons until I tell you that you may." He said, "I will not." She said, "You may, however, beginning today, sit at our table on any day of the week, and not only on Sundays, and you may. When Matteo next asks, which he will, tell him that you have known me since I was very young, and that we were very close, and that we were parted by a misunderstanding, and that you have been a long time finding me. You may say no more than that, and you may say no less." He said, "I will say exactly that." She said, "You may, beginning today, bring small gifts, the kind that do not embarrass them. You may bring books. You may bring tools. You may not bring sweets, because Tomas will be impossible." He almost smiled. He declined. He said, "Agreed," she said. "You may continue to live above the Chandlers, because the village has decided what it has decided, and I will not unsettle the village for our own convenience. You may continue to come to supper. You may continue not to touch them until they touch you, and you may now, when they touch you, touch them back, the way one would touch any child one is fond of, and no more." He said, "Yes," she said, "I will not, today, tell you whether I will, in any month or year to come, allow more than this. I am not promising more than this. I am promising this." He said, "This is more than I came for." She said, "I know." She said, "The trust you settled, I am not refusing. I am not touching it either. I am leaving it where it is. If anything happens to me, it will go to the boys, through Marin, on the terms your firm has drawn. If anything happens to you, the same. I am telling you this so that you know I have read the documents, and that I am not a woman who pretends she has not read documents." He said, "I know you are not." She said, "The field above the chapel I will buy from you." He said, "It was bought for you." She said, "I will buy it from you, at the price you paid, and you will accept the money, because I will not begin this new arrangement of ours by owing you a field." He said, "I will accept the money." She said, "The passage to England you will cancel." He said, "I will." She said, "The song in Genoa." He said, "Yes." She said, "I would like, at some point, to know what she sang, because I have not sung in 7 years, and I would like to know which of mine survived." He said, "I will tell you. I will not tell you today." She said, "No, not today." She stood. He stood. They did not embrace. They had not embraced in 7 years, and they did not embrace now, because that, she had decided on the way down the hill, would be a thing that belonged to a later week, if it belonged to any week, and she would not give it to this one. She said, "Come at 6. He said, "I will." She went out. She went down the narrow stair. She walked back up the hill. She did not look at the third window from the left. She did not need to. She knew. He came at 6. He brought a small wooden box of carpenter's tools, the kind sized for a child's hand, which he had bought in the next town a month earlier and had been keeping in his trunk against the day, and he gave them to Matteo and Tomas at the door gravely, one box between them, with the instruction that they were to share without keeping score, which Matteo accepted as a challenge and Tomas accepted as a permission. The boys vanished into the garden with the box. Marin, in the kitchen, raised one eyebrow at Beatrix, which was Marin's entire commentary on the matter, and turned back to the pot. Henry came in. He took off his coat. He hung it on the peg by the door. There was a 4th peg now. Beatrix had put it there that morning with her own hammer, and she had not said anything about it to anyone, and Marin had not said anything either, and the 4th peg had simply appeared, in the way certain truths appear in certain households, by being hammered in without ceremony. He did not remark on it. He hung his coat on it. He sat at the table. The boys came in for supper at the hour she called them, with sawdust in their hair, and Tomas said, "Mother, the man is staying." Beatrix said, "The man is staying for supper." Tomas said, "The man is staying." He said it again, with the small, flat certainty of a child who had decided something the adults had not yet caught up to. Matteo did not contradict him. Beatrix did not contradict him either. She said, "Eat your soup." Tomas ate his soup. Henry ate his soup. The fig tree outside the window was obliging. The kettle on the stove behind them declined to comment. It broke quietly. She had not expected it to break that evening. She had expected it to break, perhaps, in a month, or a season, or never, and she had made her peace with all 3 possibilities. It broke at the moment Matteo, who had been studying Henry across the table, with the long, careful look that was the household's most serious instrument of inquiry, set down his spoon and said, "You have the same chin as the man in the silhouette." Henry did not look at Beatrix. He looked at Matteo. He said, gravely, "Yes." Matteo said, "That is because you are the man in the silhouette." Henry said, gravely, "Yes." Matteo said, "All right." He picked up his spoon. He ate. Tomas, who had been waiting for permission to be unsurprised, was unsurprised. He said, "I told you." He said it to Matteo. Matteo said, "You told me on Tuesday." Tomas said, "I told you on Monday." Matteo said, "On Monday you told me he had a horse." Tomas said, "He probably has a horse." Henry said, gravely, "I do have a horse." The boys looked at him. He had won, without trying, a battle he had not known was being fought. Beatrix, at the head of the table, set her hand briefly against her own cheek, as if checking that her face was where she had left it. She did not weep. She had cried on the cliff. She had used her ration. She thought, with the dry, small voice that had kept her alive, that the ration had been an underestimate. She said, "Eat your soup." They ate their soup. Outside, the sea did the thing the sea does at 6 in the evening on the southern coast, which is to lower its voice by a fraction in preparation for being listened to. Inside, in a small kitchen that had been built by a woman with her own arms over the course of 7 years, 4 people ate, and a fifth, in the form of a small dish of salted oil and a loaf cut into even slices, sat between them as the patient witness of an arrangement that had been a long time arriving and that no one at the table proposed to name aloud just yet. Years afterward, the village told it the way villages tell such things, which is to say imperfectly and with affection. The widow Petrelli claimed until the end of her life that she had known from the first morning because of the chin. The priest, who had a more honest memory, said only that an Englishman had once helped him finish a problem in number theory that had defeated him for 2 years and that he had been grateful. The netmender's wife said that she had revised her view of softness in men. Marin, who outlived all of them, said nothing on the subject in public, and a great deal on the subject in private to her own daughter, whom she raised in the small house in Lyme that had come to Beatrix in a will and which Beatrix had given, in the 2nd year of the new arrangement, to Marin. Because Marin had carried her share of the 7 years and had never asked for anything, and Beatrix had decided that the giving of unasked for things was a habit that could be inherited as well as endured. Matteo became, in time, a builder of small bridges over awkward rivers, the kind of bridges other engineers had given up on, and Tomos became, in time, a man who traveled with a notebook and wrote down what he found, in a hand that the editors complained about and the readers did not. Olivia's brother found, in the end, the woman whose name had been on the card in the writing desk and brought her the 2nd unsent letter, and that the village did not hear about, because it was not the village's business, and Beatrix, who knew, kept it the way she kept the brass weight on the counter, by setting it precisely where it lived and not commenting upon it. As for Henry, the title, in the end, went to a distant nephew who had wanted it, which Henry had arranged in the 5th year of the new arrangement with the same quiet thoroughness with which he had once opened an account in a bank in Genoa, and he lived out his years in a small house with green shutters on the headland above a fishing village on the southern coast, with a fig tree in the garden that was, by general agreement, obliging, and a 4th peg by the door that did not require explanation. And here, by the fire, is where the story ends, and where I, who have been telling it to you, set down the brass weight and look up. If you have ever stood on a landing and decided, in the half-second between a door and a stairs, that you would be the one who left before she was told. If you have ever carried a misunderstanding so long it became the furniture of your life. If you have ever been found, after years, by someone who came not to claim you, but to put a parcel into your hand and trust you with the rest. If you have ever been the one who came, then you know what the kitchen in this story knew, which is that some truths arrive not as a flood, but as a kettle that has been on the stove a long time, and that the breaking of a long silence can be, in its own way, the quietest sound a house has ever made. Tell me, before you go, which moment stayed with you? Was it the bell that rang twice in the doorway, or the small flat hand on the shoulder by the fig tree, or the 4th peg hammered into the wall without ceremony, or the boy who set down his spoon and said, "You have the same chin as the man in the silhouette. Stay a while if you like. There is more bread on the rack, and the fire has not yet gone down. If you have found in this telling the kind of company you came for, then come back when the lamp is lit again, and sit with me, and we will open another." There is always another. There is always one more story for the listener who would rather be let in than entertained. Until then, sleep gently, and be kind to the version of yourself that once went down the back stairs, because she did the best she could with what she had been allowed to see, and someone, somewhere, is on his way up the hill with a parcel and a name and a hat in his hands, and the bell, when he reaches your door, will ring twice.